And then, so I was like deep diving into like early Christianity, and simultaneously I'm deep diving into LDS history. I reread Rough Stone Rolling cover to cover. I am just like looking up works of other historians. Like I'm doing like deep dives into the Book of Mormon, and like whether it's historical or not, like what's the evidence for and against this being like an actual ancient record, and similar to like another work that Joseph Smith produced called the Book of Abraham. And if you want to get into either of those things, I'd be happy to and talk like details. I'll leave that up to you. But I just became away just totally convinced that those things were not historical, that they were products of the 19th century.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, and that's when I was saying earlier that during this time, I tried really hard to not focus on, was Joseph Smith a bad person? Or do I not like him? Or did he say or do some things that I don't like? I tried really hard to keep it laser focused on like the core issues, the foundational issues of the faith. Like if this falls, the faith falls. In a similar way that like you would focus really laser on like the resurrection or something for Christianity. It would be like if someone comes along and says, there's really good evidence that Jesus didn't even exist, right? And if you were like, well, you're just mad because the Pope's a bad person or whatever, right? Or, and they're like, no, I think Jesus didn't exist. And it's like, if you look into that and you're like, whoa, I think he didn't exist. Well, you probably shouldn't be a Christian, right? In a similar way, when I became just convinced that the Book of Mormon was a 19th century work,
without getting into the weeds, only because many people who are watching may not be Mormon. Obviously, we have Mormon viewers as well. Help us understand what you think may be the best arguments against these Mormon works that show that they are 19th century inventions.
Yeah. So in general, and some of this was like the way I was trained. So like I studied literature in college, and I'm not an expert in this, and I don't claim to be. So I'm not being like, well, I studied this in college, so therefore. But it did give me a way of thinking about texts, like reading them closely and kind of looking for things. And there's, if you wanted to date a book, you find a work and you don't know when it's from, right? Like what tools do you use? There's all sorts of tools that you have. And this is an analogy that I've given before. If someone came and was like, here is a book of ancient Egyptian recipes. And you thought, okay, cool, ancient Egyptian recipes. I like food. I'd love to cook some of these recipes. And you're flipping through the book and like, they all seem like good recipes and they all make sense given their context. And then you get like 2/3 of the way through and you find a recipe where one of the ingredients is a potato. Okay. You would instantly know that at least that recipe was not ancient because the potato is a New World food. It was in the Americas and they had no potatoes in ancient Egypt at all. So, and if the book had always been presented as like a single volume, like throughout its provenance, through its history, that's basically conclusive evidence that the whole book's a forgery, right? Even if all the rest of the recipes are good, tasty, maybe even plausibly ancient, like you can date when that book was written. So, and that's, probably most people know that's called an anachronism, is something that's like not in its time, like anachronos, right? Not in the right time. So the Book of Mormon is filled with anachronisms. Some of them are very straightforward, like it talks about animals existing in the Americas that all the best evidence show were not here.
Like horses.
Like horses, like elephants, flocks and herds. There were very few domesticated animals that the Native Americans domesticated. It's like pretty much like the llama and the alpaca, and there's just not really a way that those animals could stand in for what the Book of Mormon text demands of them. The book is also filled with 19th century Protestant theology. And this was noticed at the time, right? Like people who read the book at the time were like, oh, this is very convenient that you've basically addressed every hot button theological issue of right now, and it's claimed it's an ancient work, and I know like there are LDS apologists who know all of these objections and have answers to them. And like, if anyone's interested, I like totally encourage you, like, the best the thing closest to Catholic Answers on the LDS side is called Fair Latter-day Saints. They changed the name recently. FAIR, Fair Latter-day Saints. And you can go there and read their apologetics, and I think people should. Like, don't just take one side of an issue. Look at both sides. That's important. But their responses always just seemed like so inadequate to me, just sort of like trying to wave things away. They would say for like the Protestant theology, like the Book of Mormon says that it's a book written for our day, right? And so we would expect these things to be in there. But like just the way they talk, all these like long sermons using very common Protestant phraseology, like you can find tons of other sermons from that time period that are using the exact same language.
And again, at what time period in history are these events said to have taken place?
So most of the Book of Mormon starts at 600 BC and goes to about 400 years after Christ. So about that 1,000-year period. Then there's a small section of the book that's supposed to take place even further back from that. But yeah, most of it is during that time. And so it's just really weird to think that there are these ancient Native American Christians running around having Protestant theological debates in like the year 200 BC, right? Like that's just, it's much simpler to just say, this is a book from the 19th century that is in dialogue with the theological questions of its day, of the year that it was published, or like the preceding years. And then for me, the biggest issue though, the biggest anachronism is like the plot of the book itself. So this requires like a little background. The early Americans saw all these, saw evidence of Native American civilization that did not match the Native Americans they saw around them. Okay. Then when by the time settlers arrived, when scientists now think that a huge proportion of Native Americans died from disease after initial contact with the Europeans, maybe as high as like 90% died in like a 100 to 200 year period. And so so when people showed up, like this idea we have of like Native Americans like being like very woodland and like rural and stuff, that impression came because there was such a die-off that many of their societies collapsed. And they're suddenly, so the land had been full of towns and
Really?
And villages. Like they had very sophisticated societies. I highly recommend a book. It's called 1491. And it like looks at like what Native Americans were like just before Columbus arrived. Like what's the best evidence? And they were very sophisticated groups, but boy, they couldn't fight smallpox, And so when the early Americans saw these large mounds and these evidence of like greater society, and then they look at these Native Americans who were like very primitive, they were thought, well, they didn't do this. Someone else did this. There must have been, so it was very common in Joseph Smith's day. This is a very common belief that the Native Americans that we see now were not the ones who built these mounds and these cities and these earthenworks. There was another civilization that was very advanced and was probably white. There were lots of people because they were very racist, right? They like, couldn't be dark skinned. They got to be white like us. And many people were like, they were probably Israelites. They were probably Hebrews. So this was like a common, so you can find multiple books from this time period that kind of purport to be like, this is the history of the Native Americans. Some Hebrews came over, or some Israelites came over to America, and they established society and civilization. But then a savage group came, and there were many wars between them, and the savage group ended up killing off the civilized white people, and that's who we see today. This was just like a trope. It was a common belief. And that is exactly how the Book of Mormon presents the history of the Native Americans. So it like fits perfectly in its time period. But it does that make sense? Kind of what I'm saying? Like that's the whole overarching plot of the entire book. There's these Israelites that come over and they end up splitting into two groups. And one of the groups gets cursed with dark skin. And there's like a light-skinned group and a dark-skinned group. And over a 1,000-year period, they like, it kind of follows their adventures, right? And their civilization. They have wars and they fight each other. And sometimes one group is good and the other is evil, and it switches back and forth, right? There's times where they merge into one group, but eventually it ends the same way that kind of everyone at the time kind of believed, which was that the savage group destroyed the civilized group. And that's who's the Native Americans today. So it was plausible to them because it kind of matched their preconceived notions.
When it was published.
Right? But it feels very strange to me to sort of claim like, no, that's actually the true story, right? And because of this, LDS apologists now, so at the time it came out, it was pretty much everyone believed that this was telling a history of all the Native Americans. Now, because we can't find any like archaeological evidence to support these Book of Mormon societies, and when you look at the geography of North and South America, there's just not plausible that like one civilization spanned the whole thing. Most LDS apologists now will say, well, this really took place in like a very small area with like a relatively small group of people, and that's why we haven't found them, and that's why it's plausible. But if you just look at it in the context of its time, it just totally looks like a product of, like, if someone were just to write a narrative, a sort of like romantic narrative of the origin of the Native Americans and published it in 1830, which was when the book was published, it just is what you would expect, right? It would tell this kind of origin story, just like today you would expect it to tell them walking across the Bering Strait, right, during some previous age. So to me, that was one of the things that I just thought, there's just no way that this is plausible, What
about the use of steel and other metals?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, lots of anachronisms. So it mentions a lot of metalwork in the Book of Mormon, and there were a few Native American groups that had very primitive metallurgy, but there's a reason why what we find is obsidian arrowheads, right? All over, because it never became like a dominant. If you really did have a civilization that mastered metal in the way that these people say that they did, they would have totally taken over, right? They would have been a huge society, because if you master metal before your enemies, like, you can't beat an army with metal arrow tips and metal swords with stone weapons and clubs. Like, you just can't do it. The metal's too powerful. So yeah, similarly, like they mentioned chariots and things like that, and there's no evidence that the Native Americans ever used wheeled, because they didn't have beasts of burden to pull them. And so they had, the closer you find Native American toys, ancient toys that have wheels on them that can like wheel around, but there was no evidence they ever had carts, that they ever had chariots or anything like that.
Wow. Hey, thank you so much for watching. Before you go, do us a favor, leave a comment, let us know what you thought of the video, like, and subscribe.